Good evening, everyone. We're going through the portion of Shelach filled with so many details, espionage, spies coming back with reports. And we'll go through the summary of the Shabbat reading this week, as we always do, and then we will try and derive some of the life messages that hopefully we can all take home and apply in our own lives. Let's just go through some of the details of the portion that we're going to read this Shabbat. It speaks about Hashem interacting with the Jewish people. The Jewish people came up with a request to go out and check out whether this promised land is actually takeable. Are we able to conquer it? Is it something that we actually want? Is it a good land? We want to check it out ourselves. We don't want to rely on Hashem telling us that He's taking us to the promised land. We want to see for ourselves. How do we know that Hashem was not so happy? Because He said, Shlach lecha anashim, you can send for you. Well, in response to your need and your desire, we're going to allow you to send spies. It's not ideal. It's not what I intended. But if that's where you want to go, I'm going to allow you to lead in that direction. But quite possibly it's not going to have the end positive results, as will be the case. So one representative of every tribe was taken except for the tribe of Levi, and they were going to form a team of 12 people who would go out and check out the land. Hashem instructs the scouts, these 12 people, to report on the strengths and the weaknesses of the land. So once they were going, Hashem said, I want you to give an objective evaluation of the strengths and the weaknesses. They came back after 40 days with specimens of Canaan's produce, huge clusters of grapes, massive specimens of fruit that indicated that it was a land that was exceptionally blessed, produce that was beyond any imagination. It's actually described in the Talmud how many people were required to carry single fruits and clusters of grapes. But even as they came with such wonderful produce, which seemed to give a message of hope and excitement, and this is the land we're about to take, they came with an ominous report. They said that the land flowed with milk and honey, absolutely, as God said, amazing. Look at the produce, amazing stuff that's growing and being produced in Israel. But the problem, they said, is that it's impossible to conquer it. We can't do it. It's actually not going to be feasible to take the land. Of the 12 people, only 2, Caleb and Yehoshua, representing the tribe of Yehuda and Ephraim, they were the only 2 that argued that Hashem would enable them to conquer the magnificent land. What are you talking about? We're going to be able to do this. But there was 10 against 2. There was the power of the numbers. And maybe people were disillusioned. Anyway, they drifted towards the negative report rather than the positive. And they began to cry that they would rather go back to Egypt. Can you imagine? They suffered so many years in Egypt. Rather go back to Egypt rather than be defeated by this new land that they would enter into. So they rejected the pleas of Yeshua and Caleb, and the Midrash tells us that the big people began to stone Yeshua and Caleb. So not only did they not want to listen to their opinion, they now became outcasts that had to get rid of them. They had to be cancelled because they were not carrying the message that everyone wanted to hear. Hashem informed Moshe that he's going to destroy Bnei Israel due to their lack of faith. They shouldn't have wanted to send spies in the first place. And Hashem said, I'd taken them out of Egypt, and I said I'm going to bring them to Promised Land. If this is where they're at, after all they've been through, they don't deserve to take the Promised Land. Moshe Rabbeinu successfully invokes Hashem's mercy. It's in this week's portion that we speak about the 13 attributes of mercy, where Moshe prays to Hashem, please, Hashem kerachum v'chanun, you are a merciful God. If you execute the Jewish people, you'll desecrate your own name, says Moshe to Hashem. People will assume that Hashem destroyed the people because he could not. He didn't have the power to defeat Canaan. That's going to be the narrative of the people watching the story unfold. They're going to say God destroyed the Jewish people and simply because he could not. He could not face the might of the Canaanite people, which is in itself something very difficult to understand. But Moshe Rabbeinu davened so hard to Hashem. I just want to say in parentheses, it's interesting that last week Moshe Rabbeinu himself said, I can't do this people anymore. I just cannot lead them. I'm unable to bear the responsibility of this people. Last week, that's what Moshe Rabbeinu said. Hashem encourages Moshe Rabbeinu to carry on leading them. This week, Moshe Rabbeinu, it's a bit of a reverse role. Hashem saying, I'm ready to destroy them, and Moshe Rabbeinu saying, no, don't give up on this people. Last week, Moshe Rabbeinu did give up on the people, and I'm just saying it very briefly, in parentheses. Last week, the issue of the people was they wanted a different menu. They didn't like the manna that was being given miraculously in the desert. They preferred to have a different menu, and they wanted meat, and they eventually got meat, and we know the story last week. Moshe Rabbeinu could not handle a people's failure if it centered around meat, food, personal gratification. If that's where people have sunk into, Moshe Rabbeinu said, I don't have the language to deal with them. But it wasn't out of an impatience, and it wasn't out of a lack of belief in this people that Moshe Rabbeinu was so upset last week. He was upset about the motive for wanting to turn away, because they wanted meat. He was much more tolerant, Moshe Rabbeinu, for a much greater misdemeanor, and that was lack of trust in Hashem. That's a human failing that Moshe Rabbeinu, the greatest prophet and the greatest rabbi, who had to deal with people that sometimes just don't have the trust that they should have. And you would imagine they should have the maturity, responsibility. They should believe more than they do believe. And Moshe Rabbeinu, this week, notwithstanding that it's a much greater sin, stood by the Jewish people and said, I'm going to defend them. And Hashem accepts. But he says that they're going to wander in the desert for 40 years. And all the males over the age of 20 that came out of Egypt, they are going to be, they're going to die in the desert. Only Joshua and Caleb, they're going to be the only link between Egypt and the promised land. Every other person who's going to go into the promised land. I'm getting a call from somebody who's on this. Second. Hi, Joy. Is there a problem with the recording? With the Zoom? Is everyone else getting sound? Can you give me a thumbs up if you're getting sound? Evie, are you getting sound? Yeah, everyone else says it must be your computer, Joy. I'm sorry. I saw you on, and that's how I took your phone call. I don't know what to do. From my side, we got sound. So Hashem says that, yes, I'm going to forgive this Jewish people, but nobody who came out of Egypt is going to go into the promised land. Only people born in the desert are going to go to the promised land. The newbies, the millennials, the people who are from the desert will get into the promised land. The only two that are going to bridge the old world, Egypt, and the new world, the promised land, is Joshua and Caleb, the two who brought the favorable report. Then the 10 scouts, the 10 spies who brought back the negative report, they died immediately. And when the Jews were informed of Hashem's decision, now they lamented and they grieved. And not only did they grieve and lament, and now they were remorseful. Why didn't we trust in Hashem? Now they turn around and they do the opposite sin. A group, number 15, enters Israel against Moshe's warning. So a group of people said, no, we gung-ho, right, we did the wrong thing. We shouldn't have doubted. We're ready to go. We're not going to wait 40 years. We're going to go now. Moshe Rabbeinu says now is no longer the time. Now you have to wait 40 years. You're not going to be able to get into the promised land. So against Moshe's warning, they go up, and they are a huge number of the Jewish people are massacred, and they die by the hands of the Amalekites and the Canaanites. They didn't have Hashem on their side, because now was not the time. Hashem said now it's going to be 40 years in the desert. Wandering around, maybe we'll have time to discuss even that process of 40 years in the desert. Full stop. We changed the whole subject, which deals with the spies and sending the spies and the report of the spies, interaction between Moshe Rabbeinu and Hashem. Full stop. And seemingly, disparate issues that have nothing to do, although everything has to do with the narrative and the storyline of the spies. We commanded that sacrifices have to be accompanied by a wine libation, that they would stand on top of the altar and they would pour wine. On certain occasions it was water, but wine, that would run down the side of the altar to the very foundation, to the yesod, to the foundation of the altar, and that had to be done on every occasion that a sacrifice is brought. And then it spoke about flour offering that was mixed with olive oil, some meal offerings, how they were made. Another law, challah, which is something that women are very careful to do when they bake challah, is to separate challah. That when we knead dough, a certain amount of dough, a portion must be taken and given to the kohen. Today we cannot give it to the kohen, but nevertheless we separate it, and it's one very beautiful, specific mitzvah that is in the domain of particularly of women. Although it's on the dough, and if there isn't a woman to separate challah, a man should. Another law, seemingly not connected, a Sanhedrin that erroneously brings the community to idolatry must bring a special sin offering, and which one it is. The laws regarding an individual who's guilty of idolatry, whether he did it by mistake, whether he did it intentionally, what are the laws? Full stop. Story, history. A man is found desecrating the Shabbos. To cut the story short, he's executed for demonstratively undermining the word of Hashem and demonstratively going against Shabbos, which in itself is a law that centers on faith. Hashem created the world, 6 days, 7th day he gave us. So the presence of Hashem is sensed and felt and magnified through our fulfillment of the day of Shabbos. So somebody demonstratively undermining the Shabbos was executed. Finally, the last paragraph of this week's reading relates to tzitzit. The final paragraph of the Shema, which we recite every single day. Hashem said to Moshe, you should make 4 cornered garments that will have tassels tied to the corners of the garment, as the talus does. And when a person will see the strands that are arranged in a particular number, in a particular order, they will remind us of all the commandments of Hashem and not to follow the temptations of our heart. We won't turn away from Hashem because we'll be reminded. And as human beings, unfortunately, we need reminders telling us to stay committed to Hashem. That is a summary of this week's portion. And we're going to go through some of the messages that we can take from it. We said that in the opening words, Hashem said, Shelach lecha anashim, send it for yourself. For you, send the people. For me, says God, not a great idea, and that was not something that I suggested. But if that's where you're at, that you're needing to test Hashem and to find out whether the land is really good and not rely on Hashem, who's made that promise, Shlach lecha, go and send for yourself, as your mind dictates. I'm not instructing you. If you so desire, then you'll send. For the people of Israel had come to Moshe saying, let us send men before us, as it's written in Dvarim, and you all approach me. And Moshe consulted with Hashem, and Hashem said, I've said that it is a good land. By your life, I'm now going to give you the option and the opportunity to err. So if it's in your hands, human beings arranging the course, then it can have good and it can have bad consequences. We now have the opportunity to err. We're not following the directives of Hashem. We're following what Hashem is allowing us to do in following our own requirements and desires. I cannot but think of the fact that the word lecha, sent for you, is the same word that was said to Abraham Avinu so many years before when he went out on the test that God sent him, and he said, Lech lecha, go for you. But that was the real you. You know, we all have different yous. We have our own persona, the essence of who we are. And when that essence is our soul, which is connected to Hashem, then we're going in the right path and it's going to lead to success. Then the challenges of life, as with Abraham, brought about tremendous growth and tremendous strength in himself and in his impact on the world around him. But if the lecha, if the you is a you is an inner voice that is doubting, that is not strong, that is not able to rely on a force bigger than ourselves. When we start thinking that we must dictate how the course of events are going to unfold, that lecha, that essence of you, is not a good you. We have different yous, we have different essences. Sometimes our Yetzer Tov, our godly soul, our Nefesh Elokis is speaking, and then that you is something that we want to listen to, and sometimes another you takes over, and it's doubtful, and it's not sure, and it's got to check, and it's about me, and about my ego, and what I say, and what I think, not reliant on Hashem. The lecha, the essence of who we are, we always have to evaluate which voice is it. Is this a voice that is coming from a godly source, an attached source, one connecting to Hashem? Or is it a voice that is filled with arrogance and ego and detachment from Hashem? So now we see that Hashem calls Hoshea, that's his name, Hoshea bin Nun, and he gives him an extra yud from Hashem's name, and as of now, he will be called not Hoshea, but Yehoshua, which is adding a yud in the front. And the Gemara in Saita, where it talks about this whole episode at great length, we learned it recently between Pesach and Shavuot. The custom is to learn the tractate of Sota, which has 49 pages, for the 49 days between Pesach and Shavuot. And in that tractate, on page 34, Daf Lamed Daled, it speaks about this whole episode of the spies and then the historical events. And it says over there that when Hashem gave the Yud of God's name to Hoshea, he transformed him. There was Hoshea without the Yud, and then there was Hoshea with God's name, Yehoshua. As we said before, when our identity is associated with that which is godly, and that, in the case of Hoshea, God impacted on his name, on his very being, that he now had the name of the Yud of God in his name. That way Hashem said, may God save you. That Yud, Hoshea, means to save. God will save you from the counsel of the other guys, the spies who came back with a negative report. So in actual fact, we had two people coming back with a positive report, and they had two different reasons as to why they did have the strength to withstand the test and to be able to be strong enough to stand up against the 10 other spies. Joshua, as we just said, Joshua got the Yud of God's name, which gave him a godly strength that completely transcended the human ability. And Kalev, we learned in Rashi and told in the Medrash that he went looking for Hebron so that he could visit the gravesites of the Avos of the fathers and the mothers of our people Israel. It was a holy place. So we actually have a biblical precedent that in times when there's a great need and we're concerned and we're worried, to go to the kever, to the resting place of a tzaddik, and to daven there, to ask Hashem to give us what is so desperately needed, and to say that in the merit of the people that are buried there or interned there, Hashem should answer us in our desire. So whilst we never ever are allowed to go to talk to the dead, in fact, it's one of the negative prohibitions in the Torah, when it comes to visiting the gravesite of a tzaddik, there is holiness that is found there and strength that can be found from there. And the biblical precedent is the narrative that is given to us from the Midrash that Kalev went to Hebron specifically to seek out the strength and the power of being able to withstand the test and withstand the energy that was coming from the negative 10 reports, the report of the 10 spies that was negative. I want to share something additional about the interesting thing about the 10. Now, this is the first time in the Torah that we talk about a gathering of 10 men. Well, actually 12 men, but two of them gave a positive report. And the 10 who gave a negative report were called by God Eidah Hara'ah, an evil congregation, an evil gathering of people. What's interesting is that the Talmud gives us the source of a minyan. We know that when we say Kaddish, we have to say it with a minyan. When we say Baruch Hu, minyan. When we read the Torah, it has to be a minyan. 10 people, 10 men to make up a minyan. How do we know this? Where do we know that 10 men constitute a quorum to be able to evoke certain prayers and to say Hashem's name and to proclaim the greatness of Hashem and to say various blessings and read the Torah, as we said, Kaddish? All of those things can only be said in the presence of 10. Where do we get this thing that 10 matters when it comes to people? And it's incredible that the Torah tells us, the Talmud tells us that the place that we learn the power of a minyan is from the 10 spies. The 10 spies that came back with a negative report. They spoke with a negative angle about the Jewish people and about the land, about the hope of going into promised land. The spies that came back with a negative report is the source for the power of 10. And there's a lot written about it, but one of the thoughts that I always try and hook into is that if 10 people can cause so much harm, if the combined energy of 10 people created an exponentially greater threat because of negativity and because of a bad, evil report, if that's where 10 people and the power of 10 can take us, then how much more so if 10 people gather together to proclaim the presence of Hashem, to say Kaddish, to sanctify God's name, how much more so is there exponentially greater power when 10 people are doing good? We learn it from bad because it's counterintuitive. If bad can happen to the extent that it did, because 10 people influenced the whole of Bnei Israel to be so undone in their belief of Hashem and to go in the wrong direction, if that power of 10 can happen for negative, then for sure it can happen for good. It's learned from the verses because it says, "V'nikdashti b'soich b'nei Israel," I'll be sanctified in the midst of the Jewish people, and the word b'toich is used in the context of Eidah, of a congregation. So there's a laddergram of verses that draw our attention from the spies, and we know there were 10, to the fact that when we proclaim Hashem's name, we need 10. It's just strange that that's the source for the power of 10. And what I'm suggesting is that it's so counterintuitive that it actually adds emphasis. If 10 can cause so much disruption, imagine if 10 people get together to proclaim Hashem's name. It's exponentially greater than the power and the sum total of the individuals. Now Rashi tells us that when you are about to give a report and you're about to evaluate something, so it's human nature that it's better to see the negative followed by the good than the other way around. Because what you're left with is what leaves a taste in your mouth. The last thing somehow carries. So Hashem said, go up through the Negev. We all know that the Negev is not known for being the most lush area agriculturally in Israel. Miraculously, Israel has found a way to even cultivate the Negev. Some of the most famous designer wines are grown in the Negev, but that's the exceptional abilities of the farmers in Israel and the scientists in Israel. But generally, the Negev is the most barren of all the land in Israel. When they originally wanted to divide Israel into two and to give half of it to the Jews, and the Jews accepted it, and the enemies did not accept it, the division was to give mainly the Negev to the Jewish people. The bulk of the land allocated to the Jewish people was the Negev. The Negev is a place that does not much grows, not much agriculture. So Hashem said, go up through the Negev so that you'll see the negative, but then at the other side of that, you'll see this tremendous, powerful agricultural yield. You'll see these massive fruits and clusters of grapes that are going to take a number of people just to carry the cluster. That's how lush and beautiful it is. So that by the time they come back, the experience of the Negev will be forgotten and lost in the new experience of seeing such wonderful produce. That is the manner of merchants, says Rashi. First, they show the lesser quality of merchandise, and they build up to the crescendo when they can actually show, and this is what I also have to show you, the best of the best. That's how Hashem wanted it to go. let them see the least valuable before the most valuable, so that the taste that will remain with them will be the most valuable. So before we get to a more in-depth understanding of the SPIES, I want to talk about negative reporting, which is how we labeled today's shir, the class today, that there's something called honest reporting, and then there's called an agenda and manipulation. It's interesting that today we live in a world where we have a confusion between what is news and the reporting of news and what is opinion. In the old days, long time ago, once upon a time, when you opened up a newspaper, you knew that the editor had a place in the news of the newspaper to put forward an insight that related to his or her opinion about world events. So when you read that page, you knew that that was opinion. This is what is the opinion of the editor. And therefore, you'd have some newspapers like the New York Times, or you'd have the New York Post, and they have different opinions that are reported in the newspaper. But unfortunately, what became blurred in our thirst for news and in the abundance of reporting that happens in the news is that not only is there a page dedicated to being able to express one's opinion, everything becomes opinion. Everything that we read and that is reported to us is slanted in an angle of a particular motive and a particular agenda, and we embrace it. Once upon a time, people used to think that in a world where people are going to be able to have access to information, they're going to be the most informed. So today we could think that in a second we could put on our search on Google, and we could search through information. We have access to information as people didn't dream of having access to information 10 years ago, a very short amount of time ago. So today we must be the most informed people because we have access to information. But what actually has happened in terms of perspective? Has our perspective of knowledge developed and grown? In fact, the opposite has happened. Look what happens to all of us. When we watch a YouTube once, twice, 3 times, they know, this artificial intelligence knows that this is your preference, and it starts directing you to sites that are going to feed what they know that you're interested in. And so it is with opinions. If you listen to some guy giving an opinion once and then again and again, they now know that you're right-leaning or left-leaning, that you're conservative, or that you're enlightened, or that you're progressive, and you now become part of a very small, narrow group of people. The people that you listen to and the people that you surround yourself with, the friends that you surround yourself with on Facebook, and the sites that you visit on YouTube or on Google are now going to be very specific sites. And you're going to hear in an echo chamber the same opinions said again and again and again. In actual fact, with all of our ability to have knowledge unfiltered, without any adult or person around deciding what we can and what we cannot listen to, we have nonetheless become isolated in our own little bubbles of knowledge and information and preferences. And we live in a world that is less informed of diversity of opinion than in times gone by. We now have a particular angle and a particular narrative, and that's the world we live in. And it's very sad that every bit of information that comes our way, we need to have the depth of understanding and the objectivity to say, well, is this really news, or is this somebody's opinion? And unfortunately, in a world where there is so much intention to bring an opinion to the public, to influence the public, you have influencers. So you have so much being dictated to the world opinion by sites, by prominent people, by powerful people, by sports people, by models, by people who are famous. When they say something, it influences. And that becomes the narrative. And eventually, if you say anything different, you get cancelled, because that's not what is now the official view. It's a very, very sad state of affairs that with all of our opportunities for knowledge, we often are not aware to what degree knowledge has become narrow and pointed and influenced by the desires and the shenanigans of people who have an agenda. If you're not aware of it, then we can live in the dark. We can be groping around in the dark, thinking that we have information, but we're just processing opinion. So we have so much of all of these weaknesses in information being coming our way that we can derive from the spies, because they sinned and they were punished. But you could ask the question, what did they do wrong? God said to them, I want to know, with all the warts and all the failures and all the weaknesses, see the strengths and see the weaknesses and come back and give a report. And they came back and they gave a report, and the report was negative. So what did they sin? If God said to them, go, now that you want to go and check it out and decide what you want to do and give back a report that is going to be able to identify the strengths and the weaknesses. And they saw more weaknesses. So weren't they just being truthful? Weren't they just giving a report as they thought they should give? And why were they punished? So there are, I'm just bringing 5, but there's so many more. The Mefarshim, the commentaries on this whole episode, point out human failings, weaknesses that all of us encounter in our daily lives that we can derive from the story and the narrative of the spies. The first thing that the commentaries point out is, who did they report to? Who sent them, and who did they report to? They were sent by Moshe Rabbeinu. Moses said, Shelach lecha, Hashem said, tell Moshe, send the people. Their commander-in-chief, who sent them as the spies, the scouts, to check out the land, they had only one person to report to, and that was to Moshe Rabbeinu. Who did they report to when they came back? They didn't talk to Moshe Rabbeinu. They held a press conference. They reported to the people. They began talking about information in the broadest situations, not to the person who sent them and who had the capacity to filter and to understand and to digest what it is that they had seen in the land of Israel. So the first thing is, if you report to the wrong people, you are definitely not going to find solutions. You're going to perpetuate and magnify the problem. What happens to all of us as parents when our children are at school? And what happens at school is that day doesn't go so well. Teacher said something, it wasn't, in the opinion of the parent, right. The kid said something in front of another kid, and now parents might have a very legitimate gripe, problem, difficulty that they need to resolve. But rather than going to the principal, to the teacher, or to the person in whose hand is the province to make a difference and to affect change and to find a solution, where does it happen? It happens in the car park. In fact, if you watch most meetings that discuss meaningful, important things, watch where they eventually, when everyone leaves the meeting, at the end of the time, there are huddles in the car park. And those huddles are not discussing who won the tennis yesterday. These are continuations of the meeting, and all the things that were not said in the place where it could best be handled, they're now spoken about out there. When you don't go back to Moshe Rabbeinu, who is the only person that could affect change and could use this information to better the need, to achieve the positive outcome for the Jewish people, when you report to the wrong places, it means that you have something else in mind. You're a popularist. You've got excitement. You're enthusiastic about the disheartening of the people. When you report in the public domain something that needs to be handled by the professional that has the capacity to make the difference, so you are not part of the solution. You're only part of the problem. You're magnifying the problem because you're taking the information, as important as it is, to the wrong venue, to the wrong place. I'm going to move quickly because I want to do at least one more slide, which is so important relating to the portion of Shelach. The second thing is the sandwich. How do we know there's an agenda behind a report? Is the communication of the negatives and the positives. Are the positives put in light of the negatives, or are the negatives put in the light of the positive? What is it that you're actually communicating? And when you talk about the negative and then the positive, like the negev, and then you go up to see the lush fruits, so then the positive is what leaves you with a positive taste. That's what you're left with. Number B should be the reverse. When it came to the spies, they first spoke about the positive, and then they were able to direct any positive impact that could be derived from what they'd seen into the negative, so that the final analysis, you're left with a negative. Whenever a sandwich like that takes place, when you're doing a report and information, and you say, although there's so much good, but there's the problem, then you leave people with a problem, not with a positive. If you say there are a number of negative elements that have to be dealt with, but look at the tremendous positives, so you can clearly see what the agenda and what the underlying purpose of the communication is. So the second failing pointed out by the Mefarshim, by the commentaries relating to the spies, is that they first said the positive, the reverse of what I've written over here, and then they drowned out any possible influence by having such positive information presented to the people by all the negative that came afterwards. So the negative overwhelmed any element of the positive. The third thing that is discussed in the commentaries is that they were scouts. They had to come and give a report. A report is an objective analysis of the events. We saw this city and we saw that city. We saw this fortification. We saw walls of this height, and we saw armaments, and we saw weapons, and we saw people. All of that is a report. But who makes the conclusion as to whether we can take the land or we cannot take the land? The commander-in-chief. A spy who works for the FBI, who works for the CIA, and he's spying out in another country and comes back. His job is not to make conclusions. He doesn't decide whether there's going to be an attack or a war, or there's going to be a overture to the United Nations, whatever might be the decision. Who makes that decision? The general, the person in charge of the war effort. The spy is a cog, a detail in this whole big decision-making process. So when somebody comes along and says, I'm giving you a report, but in the report, one finds a conclusion as to what you should do with that report, that's not an objective report. That's not just giving information. It's saying that as a result of this information, this is what I feel we should do. And that's what the spies, the 10 negative spies, said. We saw terrible things over there. It's impossible for us to take it. And therefore, we're going to dishearten the entire people by having a conclusion that as a result of what we saw, we cannot take the land. They overstepped their bounds. They were meant to give a report. They weren't meant to be generals in the army to make decisions as how to deal with the report. The fourth area, which is much, much a part of our lives and our inability to find solutions, is the generalization. They came back and they said, we saw wherever we went, we saw giants. And in actual fact, they saw giants in one particular place. But the way they communicated it was not to say that we saw giants in a particular place. They gave the implication that there were giants all over. That's called the generalization. That's the agenda of saying, I'm not going to allow for any solutions to be found because I'm going to broaden the scope of the problem to the extent that it's impossible to find solution. When you do marriage counseling and you're talking to relationships between human beings, a husband and a wife, and the wife says that the husband is always coming home late. He never takes out the garbage. She always burns the supper. And she never gives him time to, whenever it's never, always, ever, That's a generalization. The chances of finding a solution become minimized by talking about a generalized situation rather than isolating, identifying, and zeroing in and focusing in